Welcome to part 2 of my advanced lens adapting tips. Okay, now let's talk about some of the finer points of adapting camera lenses. Number 1, if you've got a stuck screw on a mount, don't try to force it out. You could strip it. Rather, get yourself some acetone, in other words, also known as nail polish remover, and a Q-tip. Dab the Q-tip in the fingernail polish remover or acetone, and then dab the Q-tip with the acetone on it on the screw that's tight. Let it sit for a couple of minutes, and then come back and give it another try, and it'll probably be loose. Number 2, if you ever run across a mounting screw that is not magnetic, probably made of aluminum. Some older lenses have aluminum mounting screws. They're soft, they strip very easily, and carefully take them out and then throw them away and replace them with steel magnetic screws. Tip number 3, some lenses have a rear element that protrudes outside of the back of the lens, beyond the rear lens mount. And if you have a lens like that, be mindful that if you set it down, it's going to scratch the lens. So check out the rear element, and if it's protruding beyond the rear mount, retract the lens by focusing it at as close as possible. Retract the lens into the body. Now you can set it down and it's not going to scratch the lens. Tip number 4, don't lose tiny parts, screws, washers, things like that when you're working on a lens. And what I do is I take just an old piece of cloth and I put my lens on top of the old piece of cloth when I'm working on it. Then, if a small piece falls off, it's not going to bounce off the hard surface table onto the floor or get lost in the carpeting. It'll get stuck right in your cloth. Tip number 5, when you remove parts, place them on your working surface in the order that they're removed. For example, let's say I'm working on this lens, and the first component I take off is this particular ring. Okay, I'm going to set it right here. The next thing I remove is this lens element. Okay, I'm going to set that a little bit further away. The next item that I remove from the lens is this larger lens element, and I'm going to set it down a little bit further away. So when I'm taking things apart, taking things out of the lens, disassembling it, I start close and then I go further away. And you guessed it, when it's time to reassemble the lens, I work in the exact opposite direction, where I start with parts that are the furthest away, and then I work my way in. Tip number 6, don't over-tighten screws. If you over-tighten screws, you could very easily strip the head, which is a real problem. So, not only don't over-tighten the screws, never use a thread locker like Loctite on the screw itself. It's going to make it really hard, if not next to impossible, to remove that screw if you have to get in there and work on the lens again. Tip number 7, reduce internal reflections. Okay? Now, some lenses, you look in the rear of the lens and you'll see all types of reflecting surfaces. Now, what I'll generally do is I'll take a big piece of black paper that has a flat black surface on each side, and then I'll cut it to a thickness, it depends upon how big the opening in the lens is, and then I roll it up, and I'll just insert this into the lens. I've made myself what is called a lens baffle, and that helps to reduce internal reflections in that lens. So if you've got the rear mount off and you see all kind of shiny surfaces inside of the rear of the lens, make yourself a baffle and stick it in there. Along the same lines, sometimes you'll have a lens that has very small shiny surfaces on it. And what I'll do is I'll take a Sharpie, a permanent black Sharpie, and I'll just write with the Sharpie on that reflective surface on the lens. And sometimes I'll let it dry for a few hours and come back and do it a second time. But it's fairly effective in reducing the reflection of that surface, of that lens surface. Number 8, keep all leftover parts and put them in a bag and label that bag. For example, this bag says Zeiss 135mm f2 lens. These parts in the bag are all leftover parts from adapting my Zeiss 135mm lens. So if I ever want to go back and unadapt it, I've got my bag of parts right here. And my final recommendation is, once you've adapted your lens, test its focus. Go outside and focus at infinity. Focus at infinity. And if it doesn't properly focus at infinity, take the rear lens mount off and either install or remove these circular shims. Some people call them washers. They're usually made out of soft brass. So test when you're all done for infinity focus, and if it's not where you want it, take the lens mount off and either add or remove these little circular shims. So there are my 9 finer points for adapting lenses. This is the last section on our advanced lens adapting tips section, and we're going to talk about using and maintaining your adapted lenses. First of all, do you know what the number 1 killer of adapted lenses is? Fungus. The way that I prevent fungus is, number 1, I put into the camera case that I have my lens in a desiccant, and I keep them together with the desiccant, and the desiccant dries out the lens case. Also, I put desiccants inside of my camera bags, my padded camera bags, and I leave them with my cameras and lenses 24/7. Also, once a year in the summer, I take all of my older vintage classic lenses out on my patio, open up the aperture wide, point them at the sun, and leave them in the direct sun for at least 1, sometimes 2 days. That helps. The UV from the sun helps to kill any fungus that might be getting a foothold in your lens. Here's another tip for you. A lot of your classic vintage adapted lenses have old, worn, slippery, cracked focusing grips. What I like to do on every single adapted lens I have is I take these multicolored silicone rubber bracelets and wristbands that I buy from AliExpress.com, and I put them over the worn, slippery focusing grip. Very easy to do. Sometimes I just put 1 on the lens, sometimes I put 2 on the lens, and then I can very easily reach down, grab that focus, and turn it without even looking, because the rubber grip feels so different than the rest of the lens. Another tip for you is that so many of your older lenses only have a single coating, or some don't even have one on the optical glass. A few years ago, I was photographing trumpeter swans in the northern Mississippi River with 2 National Geographic photographers. And these guys had giant lens hoods on all of their lenses. And they told me that lens hoods help to prevent glare, and they improve contrast in color. So ever since then, I have made it a practice on all of my adapted lenses to put the biggest lens hood I can on it, the biggest lens hood that doesn't vignette on the lens. It's a good tip for you. You can see a bunch of my lens hoods behind me, so I really do practice what I preach. When you when you operate lenses that are adapted, generally speaking, they're older lenses and they're manual focus lenses. Nailing critical focus with a manual focus lens is difficult sometimes. And what I do is one of 2 things to help nail focus, especially with faster lenses shot wide open. I get myself, if I'm using the viewfinder on that camera, is I buy myself an eyepiece magnifier like this one. This one is 1.5 magnification. And I slip it right over the back of the eyepiece, and I look in there, and it's 1.5 magnification. Some of them are 1.3, some of them are 2, some of them are 2.5 magnification. It varies. Some of them are even adjustable. Then in addition to that, what I often do is inside of a DSLR camera is a mirror. Above the mirror is a focusing screen. And the focusing screens that come with most cameras are matte, and they're not very good for precise focusing. So what I do is I go to a Taiwanese company, which is called FocusingScreen.com. And for about $80, I purchase one of their custom-made focusing screens. Now, the ones that I like the best are the ones with a split image and a microprism, both of them. And they're custom made, and it takes about 4 or 5 weeks for me to get them here in the United States from Taiwan. The other thing is, if I have a camera with live view, what I do is I focus using the LCD screen on the back using a Zacuto viewfinder. And this magnifies 2.5 to 3 times the LCD screen, and it enables you to critically nail focus with a manual focus lens. At the end of this section, I've got an excellent video that goes into great detail on how to use one of these Zacuto viewfinders. Now, here's another tip for you. When using a lens with a macro reversing lens like this one, it's mounted on here backwards, and this is the rear of the lens. The rear of the lens, the rear element is susceptible to being scratched or damaged, and you can't put a typical lens hood on it because it just doesn't fit. So what I do is I get a extra rear lens mount like this one. I like ones that are snap-on, that are made of soft plastic. And then I get myself a razor knife like this one, and I carefully cut out the center of that rear lens cap. Now you can fit that rear lens cap right on the end of your reversed lens, and it both reduces flare and it protects your lens. There's another tip for you. Now, my final tip is this. When you find yourself a great lens, keep it forever. A few years back, I adapted a Leica R 50mm f2 lens, and I put it on this very camera, a Pentax K10D. And the colors that Leica lens on this Pentax camera produced were just magical. Well, I made the mistake of selling the lens, and I regret it to this day, because that particular Leica lens, Leica R50 f2, came in 4 or 5 or 6 different versions. And also, every lens is a little bit different from another. So the chances are not very good of me ever finding that perfect lens again for this camera. So my recommendation to you is, we've talked before about being very slow to buy a lens, but also please consider being very slow when you sell a lens. I hope these advanced lens adapting tips have been helpful. We'll see you in the next episode.